Now one more important favorite question of the examiner I like to ask you. When do you call a patient with hepatitis B infection as a chronic disease, inactive carrier state and a resolved disease? What is your definition for these three important situations? If the patient is HbsAg positive, but if he is positive for longer than 6 months, then you like to call it as a chronic diseased individual. Similarly, if the HBV DNA is greater than 10,000 copies, or if there is a persistent elevation of the SGOT and SGPT, and the liver biopsy is showing all that necroinflammatory changes suggestive of the chronic hepatitis, then you call it as a chronic disease. When do you call it as an inactive carrier state of the HbsAg, doctor? He is also HbsAg positive for longer than 6 months, but his envelope antigen is negative and he already has developed antibody against this envelope antigen. Such an individual is called a HbsAg carrier, but an inactive carrier who is not actively replicating the virus. Finally, you have a resolved disease where the patient has got anti-HBC and he is also HbsAg negative, and there is a SGOT SGPT which is normalized, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Finally, I like to ask you one of the common questions which patient will ask you. What is the lifetime risk of death of dying because of the cirrhosis of hepatocellular carcinoma if I am having my HbsAg longer than 6 months and you have graded me as a chronic hepatitis B patient? There is about 15 to 25% chances of developing is what you need to basically answer. And when do you want to treat a patient who is having the chronic HBV infection? If he is having HBeAg positivity along with the transaminases greater than twice the normal, such a patient don't leave him, because he is the one who is actively proliferating, having chronic infection, treat him. Similarly, HBV DNA is there, here the DNA will help you, and in him also transaminase levels got elevated. He is also another important indication where you have to treat. So I took a little extra time to stretch you, only to once more emphasize to you, doctor, forget about what all that we discussed. Today is the day of hepatitis B which you are going to revise, and hepatitis C once for all until your exam, because once more in the next exam which you are going to take, probably you may be taking PGH, Chandigarh or state entrance, similar question will be there and you should not do similar mistake, different mistake you should do. Let us go to the next question. Coronary blood flow, typically what is the true statement? All of you know the basic principle. Blood flow is directly proportional to the pressure and inversely proportional to the resistance is something which you should not basically forget. So it is the coronary perfusion pressure, and it is the myocardial oxygen demand, and they are the two important factors, and the compression which occurs of the coronaries during the systole, and the alpha adrenergic tone, the four deciding factors for the coronary blood flow. Let's go to the next question. What is the most important adverse effect of the ACE inhibitor? You should not forget the first dose hypotension with two important drugs. Traducing the alpha blocker and the ACE inhibitor, there is a high chance of developing the first dose hypotension. Let's go to the next question. What is the loading dose of aminophylline? So you can see once more, examiner is interested to know how well you have done your housemanship. So these are all the questions which are learnt on the ship called housemanship, doctor, you must be doubly sure. So typically, theophylline, adults and children up to 16 years, the loading dose is based on 5 milligram kg given over a period of about 20 minutes. It is a very important dosage which you should not basically forget. Now how about the maintenance dose of the theophylline is another important question. If he is a young adult smoker, it is 0.7 mg per kg per hour. Non-smoking healthy adult is 0.43. You require greater amount of maintenance dose in the smokers is a very important rule which you should not forget. Similarly, if he is a geriatric patient with cor pulmonale, it is much more lesser, 0.26. If you have a patient with congestive heart failure and liver failure, aminophylline need to be given 0.2 milligram per kg per hour is the important dosages which you should not forget. Finally, you have a pediatric patient with asthma in whom you have to give the theophylline. What do you want to do? 0.008 into age in weeks plus 0.21 is considered to be the possibility. So finally, doctor, what is your answer of the loading dose? It is about 5 mg per kg which is given over a period of 20 minutes. So 5 to 6 mg per kg is considered to be the answer for this question. Let's go to the next question. PDA, It is the prostaglandins which will maintain the patency, indomethacin is the one which closes it. So as a reason, prostaglandin inhibitors are the ones which will cause its closure is what I want to underscore to all of you. Midline cleft lip typically is caused by the failure of the fusion of what? Once more, cleft lip, when do you want to repair it? Cleft palate, when do you want to repair it? What is the underlying embryology? One of the stock questions. Now if you look at the development of the upper lip, doctor, it is the fusion of the maxillary prominences with the lateral and medial nasal prominences which will complete the formation of the lip is what need to be remembered. Typically the process starts at about 4th week of the gestation and it is completed by about 7th week of gestation is what need to be understood. Suppose if there is any failure of this mesenchymal migration where the union of one or both of these maxillary prominences with the nasal prominences doesn't happen, it leads to the development of the unilateral or the bilateral cleft lip. So there is a reason, doctor, it is the medial nasal and the maxillary process, non-union is the one which is responsible. If it is both medial nasal process, it is bilateral lip cleft, otherwise it is unilateral is what need to be remembered. Let's go to the next question. Lumbar hemivertebra is because of the abnormal development of which important sclerotome is a very important question. So one of the favorite topic of the examiner is notochord and its development and sclerotomal embryology. From times immemorial it had been a favorite question of the examiner. Now typically if you look at the various stages of the development of the vertebra, you have initially a neural plate, a unsegmented mesoderm and a notochord. This is a fundamental composition. But later on there is a segmentation and the somites are formed as a pair of spherical balls of these cells on the either side of the future spinal cord which is developing is what I want to underscore to all of you. Finally, as the somites happen to mature, typically they will be dividing into two important parts. They will be dividing into a sclerotome and they will be dividing, the other part is called dermatomyotome. It is this dermatomyotome which will be forming the muscles of the spine and the dermis of the skin, whereas the sclerotome will be the one which will be forming the vertebral bodies. If any problem is there in the sclerotome, then the vertebral body formation also become abnormal. Accordingly, you will be developing hemivertebrae and scoliosis is a very important final expression of this embryological defect. Now if you look at hemivertebra, the most common abnormality in the failure of the formation of the vertebra from this sclerotome is the hemivertebra is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now if you look at the hemivertebra, you are having a semi-segmented, a fully segmented and a wedge-shaped vertebra. So these are the different varieties. Similarly, you have a block vertebra, unsegmented vertebra, that the different abnormalities in the vertebra which can develop. Finally, all these hemivertebral abnormalities leads to the development of what you call as the scoliosis is what I want to underscore to all of you. So typically this gives you the posterior anterior and the lateral radiograph of the spine in this given case. What you are able to find here is there are hemivertebrae in the thoracic and the lumbar spine which have developed over here, which is leading to the development of this lateral curvature which is called the scoliosis is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now if you look at the hemivertebra, it is this ventral sclerotome on one particular side. The non-development of it leads to the development of this hemivertebra which leads to the development of the scoliosis is what you need to finally understand. So what is your answer, doctor, for this historical question? It is the ventral sclerotome, the abnormal development leads to the hemivertebra. But you may ask me one comment, what is this intermediate cell mass basically? This intermediolateral cell columns are the ones that the collections of the grey matter and they typically contain all those preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system which will be extending from the thoracic vertebra 1 to the lumbar vertebra 3. It's called thoracolumbar outflow is the sympathetic nervous system. It will be developing from this intermediolateral cell column is what you need to basically understand. Let's go to the next question. Neural crest, the defective migration typically will be resulting in which important condition? This is also a favorite question of the examiner. The neural crest derivatives is a question, any MCQ of the past 10 years of papers, you find lot of questions on this. So basically what are these neural crest cells? They derive from the ectoderm, and their speciality is they are like the mobile phones. They will be migrating extensively and they will be giving rise to a lot of derivatives, these neural crest cells. Now, what are all the important tissues which are considered the derivatives of the neural crest cells is my question to all of you. You have the pigment cells of the skin, Schwann cells, satellite cells, unipolar neurons, multipolar neurons, chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, the prevertebral plexus, parasympathetic plexus. All these things are considered to be the important derivatives is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now if you take these neural crest cells, there are a full set of disorders which are called the neural crest cell pathies, which are being identified. So you can develop tumors in the neural crest, you can develop some diseases because of the defective migration of this neural crest. So similarly, some of the tissues deriving from the neural crest are not well developed. For example, if pigment cells are not there because the neural crest problem, there can be development of albinism. So broadly you can divide miscellaneous, defects of migration, and the tumors of the neural crest is the broad division. Now one of the favorite questions which is going to be the question in the next entrance which you are going to take. Already examiner asked you the defects in migration and what are the diseases. Next time will be the question of what tumors derive from the neural crest. Now you will be doubly sure about it. Pheochromocytoma, neuroblastoma, carcinoid tumor, medullary carcinoma of the thyroid, and neurofibromatosis, they are all considered to be the tumors which are of the neural crest origin is what you need to basically understand. Now what are the defects which arise because of the problem in the migration? Hirschsprung's disease, congenital megacolon, the Waardenburg's disease, cleft lip, cleft palate, frontonasal dysplasia, thymic dysplasia, dental anomalies, Dijot syndrome, they are all considered to be the problems which arise because of the defective migration of the neural crest is what you need to remember. Finally, even albinism is also a problem with the neural crest. So the examiner asked you about defective migration, so you already have congenital megacolon over here, so it is the one which is responsible is what I want to underscore. Now finally you may like to dissect this answer by asking what is this dentinogenesis imperfecta. As a small curiosity, let us talk a bit about MDS entrance preparation also. A hereditary defect which is leading to the opalescent teeth is basically called dentinogenesis imperfecta is what you need to basically remember. Here there is an obliteration of the coronal and the root pulp is the one which is the underlying defect is what you need to remember. Let's go to the next question. The cardiac jelly which will be surrounding the heart tube, typically it contributes to formation of what? It contributes to myocardium is what need to be remembered. What is this cardiac jelly is my question to all of you. It is the acellular secretion of the myocardium. It is important for the septation of the heart and the formation of the atrioventricular canals. If you take the heart development in the early stages, it is this cardiac jelly which is the major part of the thickness of the cardiac wall is what I want to underscore. But once the cardiac tube happen to differentiate, this cardiac jelly will be disappearing and then the myocardium will be occupying the major part of the cardiac muscle. So there's a reason, doctor, in the embryological life, the myocardium in the adult is equal to the cardiac jelly is what you need to basically understand. Let's go to the next question. A 40-year-old female is presenting with a history of the dysphagia, which is of the non-progressive nature. So, finally, I want to basically this answer to be taken up by you rather than my giving the answer to you. Only thing is, let us talk about the dysphagia, one of the important complaints of the patient. If the patient says, sir, I can't swallow, the immediate question you will be asking as a house surgeon or a postgraduate is, what you cannot swallow? Is it the peppermint you are not able to swallow or the Coca-Cola you are not able to swallow? What you are not able to swallow? Should be your question. Once more, since when you are not able to swallow? Is this problem is progressing every day or is it non-progressive in nature? These two questions are sufficient, doctor, for you to decide finally what is the etiology of this important condition called dysphagia. Broadly, dysphagia is because of two reasons. Either the problem with any obstruction within the esophagus, common sense says, or there may be a neuromuscular dysfunction in the motility of the esophagus is the second important cause. So how do you differentiate between these two? Suppose if the patient is having the difficulty in initiating the swallow. Whenever the patient with dysphagia comes, you must ask, do you have only problem in dysphagia, swallowing, or do you also have any problem even in the coughing, choking, and any other things are accompanying you, is what you have to basically ask. Suppose if coughing, choking and nasal regurgitation is accompanying this dysphagia, then you will be thinking that it is a oropharyngeal dysphagia, but not at the level of the esophagus. That's how you simply differentiate. There are a lot of etiologies for the oropharyngeal dysphagia. But suppose if the patient is having the problem that only it is the food which is entering is sticking into my gullet, and typically I am having that sticky sensation persistent, then it speaks about esophageal dysphagia. Suppose if it is only for the solid food, then it is a mechanical obstruction. It is both for the solid and also liquid, then the problem is with the motility, and it is a neuromuscular dysfunction is what you have to basically remember. Once more, what is the cause for the mechanical obstruction? It can be a lower esophageal ring like the Skarsky's ring, which can cause an intermittent mechanical obstruction, which is non-progressive in nature, or it can be a progressive obstruction which is growing day by day. If the patient's age is greater than 50 years, there is a high chance that it can be a malignancy of the esophagus. Suppose if he is a relatively younger patient with the earlier history of a heartburn and the reflux esophagitis, there is a high chance of developing a peptic ulceration with the stricture. So you need to remember peptic stricture and carcinoma to be the two causes for a progressive dysphagia because of the mechanical obstruction, which is understood by only dysphagia for the solid foods, is what you need to basically understand. Similarly, if it is a neuromuscular disorder which is identified that dysphagia is both for the solid and liquid, look whether it is progressive or intermittent in nature. Only one condition can cause non-progressive intermittent type of dysphagia for both the solid and liquids. It is the diffuse esophageal spasm is a very important condition, is what you need to basically remember. Whereas, what is the progressive cause? Once more you try to identify whether there is any heartburn. Suppose if there is any chronic heartburn, then you will be thinking it is the scleroderma which is interfering with the neuromuscular motility of the esophagus. That is the reason it is leading to both the solid and liquids. The problem is what I want to underscore. Whereas if the patient is having a progressive type of neuromuscular disorder and associated respiratory symptoms like regurgitation, you should think of the possibility of the achalasia. So now you are very sure, doctor, it is both for solids and also the liquids is neuromuscular, only solids is mechanical. Among the neuromuscular, progressive, non-progressive, and if it is progressive, it can be scleroderma and achalasia, the neuromuscular causes. If it is intermittent in nature, non-progressive in nature, neuromuscular in nature, it is the diffuse esophageal spasm. This one single algorithm is sufficient provided you have treated 3 to 4 cases of dysphagia, closely followed even their up to the level of their endoscopy, you will become the champion in managing a case of dysphagia. Now some important clues in the clinical vignette which is given to you can help you to identify what is the cause. If it is a progressive dysphagia, it is neuromuscular. If it is a sudden dysphagia, what is the underlying cause is a very important clue. Suppose if it is a weight loss associated with the dysphagia, elderly individual carcinoma. If it is a regurgitation associated with the dysphagia, then you should think of achalasia. If it is a cough which is occurring in a very early part after swallowing, then it is a neuromuscular dysphagia. But if there is a cough which is occurring in the late part after the swallowing, after some duration cough is occurring, then it is obstructive dysphagia. And if there is any heartburn associated, then you should think of peptic stricture and scleroderma is what I want to underscore to all of you. Similarly, pain is a very important symptom accompanying the dysphagia. Painful dysphagias versus non-painful dysphagias is another important challenge before you. Esophagitis, of whatever be the reason, it can be post-radiation infectious like herpes simplex and monilial or pill-induced, they are all typically painful in nature. A HIV patient reporting to you with the history of the dysphagia which is very painful. Doctor, I want to kill, I can't bear this pain of my throat. When you clinically examine, there is a profuse candidiasis which is there in that HIV patient. You should not forget the monilial infection, pain with dysphagia. Once more, how is this pain? Pain is made worse if a solid food is taken, then it is obstructive, both solids and liquids, it is basically neuromuscular. Once more, when some regurgitation is happening along with dysphagia, you should look what type of regurgitation is it. It is some old food which is foul smelling in nature. If it is the one which is regurgitating in a patient with dysphagia, you should think of Junker's diverticulum. But if it is of a recent food which he has taken, morning he has eaten idli, by about 12 p.m. he is having regurgitation of the fresh idli, you should think of the possibility of achalasia like conditions is what I want to underscore to all of you. Similarly, halitosis along with the dysphagia is another important feature of the Junker's diverticulum. And one more thing is, you can ask a patient with dysphagia, repeatedly if you are swallowing, is it improving or is it worsening, is what you should ask. Suppose if it is relieved by repeated swallows, classical history in a case of achalasia cardia, in whom the dysphagia will be relieved by repeated swallowing, is what you need to basically understand. And similarly, cold foods, if they are causing the dysphagia to become worsened, it is once more the neuromuscular motility disorder is what I want to underscore to all of you. Whatever be the situation, doctor, how can you identify the truth? It is the barium study, esophagogram, especially if you are suspecting the obstructive lesion, is considered to be the investigation of choice in evaluating a patient with a dysphagia, is what I want to underscore to all of you. So at the end of all this, let us go to the next question. Hyperacusis in the Bell's palsy is because of seventh nerve, S for 7, S for stapedius is what you need to remember, which is responsible for the development of hyperacusis. Let's go to the next question. A patient with leukemia who is having a bleeding diathesis and features which are suggestive of DIC. We should not forget the acute promyelocytic leukemia is among the leukemias which has got a good prognosis with treatment and a bad prognosis without treatment. Very important rule. Why, doctor? Which drug is considered to be the life-saving drug in the case of the acute promyelocytic leukemia? If you happen to initiate, patient will improve just like anything. It is a retinoic acid which will bring a wonderful improvement in a patient with acute promyelocytic leukemia. So if your histopathologist happen to phone you when you are the duty resident that your patient has got an acute promyelocytic variant of leukemia, be happy about it. That retinoic acid I am going to order in patient is going to improve. But at the same time, if you have not alerted your blood bank to make ready the fresh frozen plasma platelets, every armamentarium to counter the DIC, suddenly in the midnight your patient with acute promyelocytic leukemia will profusely bleed because of the prolonged APTT and PT, and he will succumb. So that's the reason, doctor, a good blood bank support must be there, and the timely administration of retinoic acid is going to create miracles in the management of the acute promyelocytic leukemia, is something which you should not forget. Sodium potassium pump is an example of. This kind of questions are like a few rains in the midst of the heat of the summer in Hyderabad kind of questions. So you can take a sigh of relief. Okay, at least I am not going to land in negative marks in the exam, is what you can definitely say. So that's the reason sodium potassium pump is a classical example of active transport, is what need to be remembered. Similarly, succinate dehydrogenase inhibited by malonate. Once more, Michaeli-Menton's constant, differences between competitive, non-competitive antagonists. So these are all the things which must be there in your tips, doctor, which will cause Vmax change, which will cause Km change, and what type of change. All these are very important. So competitive inhibitor, because it is structurally similar, is what you need to remember. Malonate and oxaloacetates are the inhibitors of the succinate dehydrogenase, which will be catalyzing the succinate to get converted into the fumarate, is a very important rule which you should not forget. Let's go to the next question. What is the pH calculation? That's what our chemistry teacher has taught us. So you're all very brilliant. Let's go to the next question, doctor, quickly. Cytochrome C oxidase typically is blocked by which important drug? So basically, if you take the electron transport chain, another favorite topic of the examiner, there are various levels at which various changes happen. You need to remember there are 4 important complexes into which you can divide this electron transport chain. Now complex 1 has got a NADH dehydrogenase like activity. Complex 2 has got a succinate dehydrogenase kind of activity, and complex 3 is having coenzyme Q reductase activity, cytochrome C reductase activity, and complex 4 is called basically the cytochrome oxidase. The last complex is the one which will be finally be donating the electrons to into the hands of the oxygen, so it is called cytochrome oxidase. Now what are the inhibitors of these various complexes? It is the cyanide and carbon monoxide which will be inhibiting the cytochrome oxidase which constitutes the complex 4. Antimycin A will be blocking the complex 3 which is otherwise called cytochrome C reductase and coenzyme Q, ubiquinone. And rotenone, which is the common rat poison, will be blocking the complex 1 which is constituted by the NADH dehydrogenase, is a very important rule which you should not basically forget. Once more, it is a standard question of the examiner. Let us talk about the cholera toxin. So generally, why this discussion should help you is, while reading a book we become suddenly obsessive. Hurray, I did not read that part, this part. So you must be very sure before opening book only what topics I am going to revise and close this book and throw off. Before sunrise and sunset, one topic, one subject must be over. Then only you are doing a correct preparation, doctor. But don't accuse me. Sir, you are taking for 50 questions only nearly 2 hours of time. You are talking about sunrise and sunset. But this is a little extensive session. But what you need to remember is a quick cursorial view of main things is what you need to basically remember and answer in the tomorrow's exam. You can see questions are very simple provided you know what topics to focus when you are opening the book. So cholera toxin, typically what is the main function? Basically if you take the GIT, doctor, if you look at the secretion of the fluid is dependent on the chloride, amount of the chloride which is leaving the apical membrane. Basically all those tight junctions of the GIT are permeable to only the cations and the water but not to the anions like chloride. So that is the main reason why the loss of the sodium and water occurs only at a very low rate because of this property that the tight junctions will not allow the anions is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now what happens if the membrane is suddenly made to become permeable to the chloride? Then the chloride will be moving out of the cell, it will be dissipating that potential, and because of the dissipation the sodium is no more stopped from leaving and it will be leaving, and that leads to development of the secretory diarrhea is what I want to underscore to all of you. However, cholera toxin will cause the permeability of the chloride to increase dramatically against these tight junctions which are otherwise impermeable to the anion like chloride is my next question. The cholera toxin will permanently cause the activation of the adenyl cyclase. It is like that mobile card facility, lifetime card kind of facility it will create. That will increase the cyclic AMP, it will cause cyclic AMP dependent proteins to become phosphorylated, and that will cause the chloride permeability to increase, which will cancel all that potential which is stopping the sodium, and the sodium will be lost. So that leads to development of the secretory diarrhea. So what is your answer, doctor? It is a continued activation of the adenyl 8 cyclase by the cholera toxin is what is going to be your answer. So one of the army medical man has said about the cholera that the bottom falls out of your world while the world falls out of your bottom is what is described about that buckets full of cholera secretory diarrhea is something which you should not forget. Now let us talk about atherosclerosis. So as a cardiologist, if you are bored about doing continuously interventions, you can take a short break, go to a conference and give a lecture about biochemical basis of atherosclerosis. So that's what you are going to do tomorrow as a cardiologist. So now let us talk about the homocysteine. Why it contributes to the atherosclerosis? 3 important reasons. There is a direct toxic effect that will be damaging the cells which are lining inside the artery, and it will be interfering with the clotting factors, and it will also cause the oxidation of the LDL. A oxidized LDL is a dangerous LDL. It is like having a AK-47 rifle in its hand. It will go and injure different tissues is what you need to basically remember. So homocysteine is implicated is what need to be remembered. CA125 is a marker of which important tumor? Once more, tumor markers. Ovarian tumor is a favorite topic. Last time it was asked, among the ovarian tumors, is it germ cell tumor or epithelial cell tumor? Which is the one which is detected by the CA125? So in future some more questions are going to come on CA125. One question which can come, let us say, let us leak the paper of AIIMS. So in the next November, let us expect if a patient is resected of the ovarian tumor, what happens to the CA125 levels? If the CA125 levels reappear, does it mean to say is it a metastasis? I mean, is it a recurrence? All these things can arise. So today you are going to master this. So Ca125 is the one which is secreted by the ovarian tumor, is something which you should not forget. Which is a very important second messenger. Once more, calcium you should not forget, doctor. Quickly rattle out, doctor, what are all those hormones where increased cyclic AMP is the underlying secondary messenger. It is the glucagon, FSH, TSH, vasopressin, ACTH you should not forget. Calcium is important for the oxytocin, vasopressin, once more, angiotensin, and tyrosine kinase is the fellow who is important for the insulin, and for the alpha adrenergic catecholamines, dopamine, it is a decreased cyclic AMP is what you have to fundamentally remember. Once more, how will the calcium act like a secondary messenger is a very important question. Calcium may be binding with a protein called calmodulin. Calcium calmodulin has got two important effects. If you take the liver, typically the calcium will be mediating the action of a number of hormones. Basically it is this calcium calmodulin which will cause a phosphorylation of some of the proteins, which will lead to the secondary actions of the calcium in the case of the liver, is what I want to underscore to all of you. So calmodulin, calcium, secondary messengers you are going to master today. Let's go to the next question, very interesting question. Chargaff's rule is what we all studied in our plus 2 while preparing for the medical entrance. In fact, adenine and thymine, cytosine and guanine are the ones which are pairing with each other. As much adenine is there, that much thymine must be there in a double stranded DNA, and as much guanine, that much cytosine should be there. So in this given case, basically you are having adenine, guanine, cytosine and thymine. There is no uracil, so there is no chance that it can be RNA. It must be DNA. Once more, is it a double stranded or a single stranded is important. There is 32% adenine but 33% thymine. So Chargaff rule is not properly honored here. So it is less likely to be then in that case a double stranded DNA. So it must be a single stranded DNA is a possibility. So you can veto this possibility if you have got a better logic for answering this question. I'll go to the next question. A randomized trial comparing the efficacy of the two regimes has shown that there is a difference which is statistically significant with a p-value less than 0.001, but in reality there is no such difference in their efficacy. Then what is this a classical example of? Alpha error, beta error are the two errors. The definition of that you have to basically know. What do you mean by alpha error? It is the probability that after you have assumed a null hypothesis, what is the chance that a given particular statistical test has generated a error because of the false positives, and those false positives have created an impression unexpectedly, as such there is a statistical difference which exactly is not existing. So that is the reason, doctor, the error which is generated in your interpretation because of the false positives which deviated you away is called the alpha error, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now, can you be able to design any kind of research where there are no false positives? Impossible. At most what you can do is, if I conduct this test, what is the chance of the false positives being generated here? So you will assume it beforehand only, you will accept your error of commission and you will set one particular criteria or an alpha level before starting your statistical interpretation. So this kind of criteria which you have set beforehand to take care of that inevitable false positives which are going to arise in a statistical test is basically called the alpha error level, which is set for every statistical test. Then you have got a beta error. What is the meaning of it? It is all those false negatives which can create a bias in your interpretation of a statistical test. What is a false negative? Patient has got a disease but you are not able to identify it, and you have given a report that he is negative but he is actually having the disease, which is the false negativity. So if you have conducted a diagnostic test or a statistical observation, there is very much a possibility, though you have assumed that the person is not having that particular problem or there is no statistical difference, still it may exist. So to take care of that component, you will be basically be setting one important level called beta error level, is what I want to underscore to all of you. So you can shortly summarize, sweetly summarize, that alpha error is the probability of accepting a hypothesis when it is not true. And beta error is the false negativity, that is the probability of rejecting a hypothesis when in fact it is true. Is basically called beta error, is what I want to underscore. So what is the examiner has given you? There is a statistical significance which is appearing when you have calculated the p value, but actually there is no real difference which is existent. Then what is happening over here? What is happening is, though it is not true, there is no statistical difference in truth. Still you are accepting the hypothesis because the p-value statistically is showing that there is a difference. So there is a reason it is an example of an alpha error, is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. There is a lot of blah blah in this. All this is not really required to be remembered. At least you must know what is the meaning of alpha and beta. That's more than enough. Let's go to the next question. In a chi-square test, when there are 4 rows and 4 columns, what is the degrees of the freedom? So this is all what we have done in our biochemistry days, calculation of the degrees of freedom. What do you mean by degree of freedom, doctor? It is with how much precision an estimate has got a variation. It is basically the degree of freedom. The general rule is, if the degree of the freedom decreases, we have to estimate more parameters, and vice versa is a very important rule which you should not basically forget. 4 rows, 4 columns. So 4 minus 1 into 4 minus 1 is equal to what you call 3 into 3 is equal to 9 is what you have to basically remember. So otherwise, about degrees of freedom, you need to know that when 2 statisticians are talking to each other after having a booze, one statistician has said, recently you got married, how is your married life? So basically the other statistician replies, it's okay, but only thing is with a loss of degrees of freedom. So there's a reason, doctor, calculation of the degrees of freedom is very important in any statistical test. Now this is a very challenging question. One of the common question if you are a veteran in taking the entrance exam, sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive accuracy, and how to calculate each of them. These are all some topics on which you have to have the mastery. Even case control trial, difference between cohort and case control. So anyway, you all become masters. By about September, doctor, rains are over and slowly the winter is starting. You must be ready like the Scud missiles to attack the entrance. There should not be any kind of waiting for the date, looking for the reservation, waiting list. All these have no meaning. So you must be sure revising all the 1500 topics which we are planning, and also mastery on the finest aspects of the preparation is what you have to finally come to.